Story number 108. This one is called The Mischief of Mr. Mugaku. Gotta love that title. So, this one, I guess it's written in third person, I don't know. But here it goes. There was a couple in their mid-30s named Margot and Richard Thompson. You see, Margot and Richard, they were, I think Richard was an accountant, and it says here that Margot was a hairstylist. They met somewhere at a convention, and one thing led to another, and 3 months later, Richard proposed. You gotta love how that works. So, they plan and plan and plan, and then months later, they have a beautiful wedding. A beautiful wedding in July. It's very sweaty heat, but oh well. What do they care? They're getting married. So, then they decide to, again, just reading from what I have here. They decide to go somewhere. People usually don't go for a honeymoon. You see, honeymoons are usually a tropical getaway or something of that sort. But you see, they wanted to do something different. They wanted the getaway aspect of it all, but the tropical part, they wanted to do something unique. So what they decided to do was go online and look for something local. Very local. You see, they lived in Louisiana, but they lived in Lafayette. They lived in Lafayette, Louisiana, and both of them, for some reason, had never been to New Orleans. Nor had they been to the Mardi Gras festival. Now, they didn't want to go to Mardi Gras. I mean, I don't even know if it was around the time of Mardi Gras. But they did want to go to New Orleans. They really had heard so many stories about the culture and the vibe and whatnot. So, hey, there you go. They wanted to go to New Orleans, and they wanted to go to a bed and breakfast. And they wanted to stay at that bed and breakfast for about a week. And during that week, they would stay up and have sex. I mean, loads and loads of it, right? I mean, they're newlywed. I mean, they're like rabbits at that point. And that's what they wanted to do, and that's what they did. They went online, and they found this beautiful old country home in New Orleans. On acres, you know, farmland kind of a deal. You'd find an old dirt road, and you drive down it, and there it is. There's Mr. and Mrs. Walton's bed and breakfast. Evangeline and Timothy Walton, to be exact. Evangeline and Timothy Walton, they were an elderly black couple who were very local to New Orleans. They grew up there all their lives and were very familiar with the culture, and they were in a bed and breakfast not too far from downtown that would, you know, suffice travelers or even honeymoon couples. So they reached out to these, Richard, he reached out to Mr. and Mrs. Walton, and he sent them an email requesting to stay with them for a week. And of course they happily obliged. It was a more expensive package, but Richard was willing to pay. And they went for it. So it was booked, right? It was perfect. Richard and Margot Thompson would spend an exact week in New Orleans, in a bed and breakfast in New Orleans. And that was it. That was their perfect getaway. Isolated from society. The only way they would even venture out was to maybe go to a local market or an antique store somewhere. But that's all they would need. Most of all, they would have isolation and each other. So they pack up and go. And they get there. And so far, the place is perfectly ideal. I mean, you drive up the road, it's a long driveway, and there's dogs, and there's grass fields, and lots of acres. And not just a grass field, like tall, weedy grass, if that makes sense. It sways in the wind, and of course at night, there's so many lightning bugs, and the stars are out, and the moon looks closer. It was perfect. They get there, and Mr. and Mrs. Walton are absolutely nice. They only have one other couple staying with them, but they're barely there, so. Anyways, Margot and Richard get in there, and for the first night, they have dinner with the Waltons, and they get along great, and well, they go back up to their room and they do what newlywed couples do. And after that, they called it a night. The next day was basically the same. It was an entire day of messing around and eating lunch, and maybe they went to the market once that day, but then they went back and, again, did what couples do. And that was it. For the first 3 days, that's all they did. They just had each other. And they talked to the Waltons, and they walked through the field, and they pet the dogs, and they had such a good time. And that was just the first 3 days, of course. Now, if you're not familiar with New Orleans culture, let me paint this picture for you. New Orleans is known to have a subculture to it, and within that subculture is, well, voodoo. You see, voodoo, black magic, has a vast amount of lore and culture attached to it, and a lot of urban legends. Now, of course, if you're just visiting, you're safe, and if you just play your cards right, you're safe from any of the black magic. And of course, it's, a bit of a modern society. I mean, this story takes place in 96, I believe, but still, it was a very modern society, so it's not as old-timey. No one's using a voodoo doll anymore. At least not to my knowledge. Anyway, having that said, Mr. Thompson, Richard, he can't help but have an interest in the voodoo culture. And there were a lot of old photos of Mr. and Mrs. Walton's family. Grandfathers, grandmothers, mostly farmers. And, of course, Richard, he was curious. He asked Mr. and Mrs. Walton if they had any voodoo legends attached to their family, because, well, that was a lot of the families in New Orleans. And Mr. Walton, he said that, yes, he did have one, but it's kind of a graphic story, and it's really not that important. All he needed to know was that someone died, and there was a lot of blood, and, well, the legend is really not that important, and it hasn't bothered their family since, so it really doesn't matter, and it's really not that important, and it's, quite frankly, boring. Richard, he accepted that and moved on with his life, and, well, later that night, he asked Mr. Walton this on the 4th day in the morning. Later that night, Margot, she went out for a walk. She went out for a walk in the grassy field, the tall wheat grass, and it was kind of windy, but not really. It was windy enough to be soothing to her, it was really humid heat back then, but she had a nice breeze going on. So she's walking through the field, and the grass is swaying through the wind, and, well, she steps on something hard. She looks down, and she sees something very, very creepy. It's a mask. Kind of like a masquerade mask, but kind of like a kabuki mask. It's black, jet black, pitch black, raven black. The face is black, and the nose is fat. And it's kind of making a smile, but there's no teeth. But the most distinct feature about this mask was the eyes. The eyes, they were red and glossy, kind of shiny. Kind of like crystals. Margot could kind of see her reflection in them, and it really made her uncomfortable. Her husband, Richard, called out to her. It was around 8 p.m., so it really wasn't that late at night, but he called to her and he said, "What are you doing out there? Come on inside. Let's, be together." Margot wanted to tell her husband about the mask, but it was creepy, and she wanted to ignore it and move on with her life. And she's on her honeymoon. She wants to have fun with her husband. What does she care about this mask that she found on the ground, right? So she just smiles at her husband and walks to him and leaves the mask behind. Later that night, after they, let's just say it, had sex, they're just, laying there cuddling, right? And, well, Margot looks at her husband, and she says, "You know, I found something interesting in the grass field." Richard's like, "Oh, what did you find?" She kind of waits for a minute. She's not sure how to explain it, but she goes, "Well, I found this mask. It was a black mask and it had red eyes. It was super creepy. It made me really uncomfortable." And he's like, and Richard, he goes, "Oh, okay, well, that's interesting. I mean, what am I supposed to do with that information?" And she just goes, "Well, I don't know, but I found it and it was creepy, and I don't know, it was just weird." So Richard just, of course, gets the idea to go look for it. And Margot says, "Well, I don't want to see it again, but if you're so curious, be my guest." So they put on some clothes and some tennis shoes, and Richard gets a flashlight, and they walk outside. Now, it's way later at night at this point. It's probably 11:30 p.m. And they walk around. They walk through the grass field, and they shine the light everywhere, and Margot remembers exactly where she was in the field and where she found the mask, so she leads Richard to it, right? She leads Richard to that exact spot. And to her confusion, she does not find the mask there. She looks at her husband and she goes, "It's not here. The mask is gone." Richard looks kind of puzzled. He's like, "Well, that's really weird. Are you sure you saw it?" And she just kind of looks at him weird too. She's like, "Well, I mean, I wouldn't make up or imagine finding a black mask, would I?" And Richard said that was a good point, and they go back inside and they forget about it. Well, not forget about it, but they just sleep it off. They wake up that next morning. It's around 9 a.m. and they're having breakfast with the Waltons. They're sitting there, and Richard kind of breaks the ice. He looks at Mr. Walton and he says, "My wife found something interesting in the field." Margot, she almost tries to tell him to stop telling Mr. Walton, but Richard continues. He says, "Well, it's, you see, my wife found a black mask with red eyes, and it really creeped her out. We tried to look for it last night, and she found the exact spot where she found it, but it was gone when we got there." Mr. Walton didn't look uncomfortable. He just kind of nodded, like he knew what Richard was talking about, but kind of prepared himself as to how to tell Richard. He took a deep breath and he goes, "Well, you see, it's kind of a part of the legend I told you about." And Richard was, kind of baffled. He's like, "Well, what legend?" He goes, "Well, you asked me if I had any stories in my family, and I told you, not really, just a few boring ones. Just an incident and something boring after that." And Richard says, "Well, was there more to it than you were giving off?" And Mr. Walton nodded. He says, "Yes, but I make it a thing to not tell people about it because it's a very scary story. It's very disturbing." And Richard says, "Well, by all means, I'm all ears." So Mr. Walton, he takes another deep breath and he says, "Well, you see, years ago, and I mean years, could have been 80 years ago, my great-great-grandfather, he was a farmer, and his brother was having sex with his wife. Now, of course, he was very bitter and full of rage and jealousy, and he had to do something. And since he was full of bitterness, back then there were demons lurking around that place, but not your typical biblical demon. Now, of course, this is all according to the legend, but supposedly, Mr. Walton's great-great-grandfather, he talked to one of these demons because one of these demons approached him one day while he was working in the field. He approached him and he said, "I know you have vengeance in your heart, and I want to help you." Now, his grandfather, great-great-grandfather, was a bit uncomfortable with a random man approaching him because it, of course, did not look like a man. It was a demon. And this demon, it was tall, very tall, and it wore a white suit. And beneath that white suit was like maybe a black shirt and a black tie. And it had black hands. And its face was like a shadow, but it was still a head. And he had red, glowing eyes and a fat nose. So, this demon tells his great-great-grandfather that he has a lot of powers, and those powers have a lot to do with revenge. And I can give you my power. All you have to do is accept it. The grandfather, of course, accepted because he was just so full of rage and revenge. So, he shook hands with the demon, and the demon said that my name is Mr. Mugaku. And here is my face. So he reaches for his face, and he takes it off, and he hands it over to the grandfather like it's a mask. And it is a mask. The grandfather holds it in his hands and looks at it. Mr. Mugaku says to him, "Put on my face, and you will have my powers." Now, at this point, Mr. Mugaku, he has no face. His face is just a black shadow almost. So Mr. Mugaku walks away, and as he walks away, he disappears. Later on, the grandfather, he finds his brother bathing in the river. He puts Mr. Mugaku's face on, and immediately becomes a different being. And as he becomes a different being, all he wants is for his brother to become blood. And that's what his brother does. His brother falls and becomes almost a pool of blood and drowns the river and makes the entire river red. He took off Mr. Mugaku's face and he threw it into the field. And that was it. He killed his brother and he moved on with his life, and his family continued. Mr. Mugaku never found their family again. The Waltons have prospered ever since. Now, Richard and Margot, they were very uncomfortable after hearing the story, and Mr. and Mrs. Walton could sense that, so they just apologized for how disturbing the story was and kind of reassured them that they wanted to hear it, so there it was. And of course, Richard was very apologetic. He was, no, sorry, it's fine, really. So they moved on. But, well, I say moved on, but I should say that they tried to move on. They tried so hard to move on. They tried so hard to just keep doing what they always do and just be a newlywed couple. But they couldn't. The legend, it just haunted them, and every night they didn't even, do stuff anymore. It was just, I mean, Margot, she would say that she's not in the mood, but that's only because she's so afraid. That's only because she's thinking of the legend. That's only because every time she sleeps, she sees it in her head. She sees the mask. She sees the eyes. She sees her reflection. Late at night, Richard is sound asleep. Margot, she wakes up. She can't sleep. She sees the mask. She grabs a flashlight, puts on some shoes, and she goes outside. She's walking around, and again, it's probably around 1:30 a.m. She's looking around, and she has to find it. She doesn't know why, but she has to find this mask. She has to. It's haunting her. She looks around. She shines the flashlight. Finally, she sees it. Or rather, it sees her. The eyes, they reflect in this flashlight. And she kind of walks up to it slowly, but there it is. In that same exact spot she found it. She looks down at it, and somehow it has more personality. She kind of stops herself for a moment, and she's just looking at herself going, "What are you doing, Margot? This is a sacred, yet evil mask. You heard the legend. You heard what it made someone do. Why would you want anything to do with it? You're on your damn honeymoon, for crying out loud. Go back to it. You've got so many more days left. It's just enjoy them while you can. So she walked away. But as she walked away, she heard something. Something very disturbing. It was laughter. Faint, hysterical laughter. And I say faint as if it's heard from a distance. She flips around. She shines her flashlight everywhere. She's looking for where that laughter's coming from, but she sees nothing. She runs back inside. She goes back to sleep. She tries to move on. Day 6. Day 6 was tricky. Richard and Margot, they go to a fruit market. They go to a flea market. They go to an antique store. They try to be a couple. And on their way back to the Waltons' bed and breakfast, they're in the car, and Richard looks at his clearly disturbed wife and he says, "Look, Margot, it's just a legend. We're letting it get to us too much." Margot looked at him and she says, "I went out last night. I went out and I found it. I found it in the same spot it was missing from. It's like it only wants to see me." Richard, he's baffled. He's like, "Why would you do that? Why would you go out and look for it? It's a demon face, for crying out loud. I mean, it probably isn't. That legend's just probably bullshit, but I mean, come on. Why would you go out and look for it?" And Margot, she's just flustered. She's like, "Because it was there, Richard. Because it was there. Because I saw it. Of course I went out to go find it. It was gone when you and I went to go look for it. That's very disturbing. That makes me uncomfortable. It's like it has a mind of its own, almost." Richard was he was almost angry at this point. He's like, "Look, Margot, this is ruining our honeymoon. We're on our honeymoon, for crying out loud. You can't ruin it like this with some dumb folk legend, some dumb voodoo story. It's probably not real. I mean, I know Mr. Walton acted like it was real, but it's probably not real. It's probably just a story passed around because it's a part of his heritage." Margot just shook her head. She goes, "No, there's something real about it. I know you don't want to believe it, but there is." They got back. They went to their bedroom. They were very silent. I mean, what more was there to talk about? Maybe they need to leave early. You know, abandon their vacation. Leave the mask behind. At least that's what Richard proposed. Margot was reluctant, but she agreed. She doesn't want something stupid like this ruining their relationship. Now Richard, he had to ask the question. He looks at his wife and he says, "Why do you think it only wants to see you?" Now, Margot, she just was very confused. She says, "Well, I'm really not sure. I don't know why it would only want to see me, but I'm just guessing that it does. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's just weird like that." Later that night, Margot, or was it Richard? Okay, it says here, Richard, he went downstairs. He looked through the fridge for a beer, and there was Mrs. Walton sitting at the table, drinking some tea. He sat down on the table and he talked to Mrs. Walton. Mrs. Walton asked him, "Well, I'm sure, but is the story disturbing you and Margot?" Richard, he nodded. He's like, "Yeah, it's gotten us into a heated discussion." "And why is that?" Mrs. Walton asked. Richard, he just kind of huffed and he took a sip of his beer and he said, "Well, Margot went out late at night last night to find it, and she found it. But we didn't find it when we both looked for it. And she has this theory that the mask only wants to see her. Now, Mrs. Walton, she looked a bit puzzled by this, but she said, well, the only reason for that, I imagine, is because she felt wronged by you somehow. And because of that, she feels vengeance towards you. Even if it's small vengeance, it's vengeance. Mr. Mugaku loves vengeance. He saw vengeance in my great-grandfather's heart, and he went for it. Now, Richard was a bit disturbed by this, and he goes, you can't believe that story. You can't believe it's real. You can't believe that there's voodoo demons out there. All Mrs. Walton had to say was, well, the mask is out there. And that's all I can say. The story's a part of my heritage, and in a way I have to believe it. Richard goes back to sleep. The next day, they have their things packed up to leave for the morning. So they're not leaving drastically early, but early enough to call it a day. So they're packing up. And Richard, he looks at his wife, who's just sitting at the end of the bed. He goes to her and he asks her if she's okay. She looks very solemn. She looks very drained. She looks very tired. She looks at her husband and she says, I had a dream last night. I was standing in the field and I heard something. I heard laughter. Very loud, hysterical, mischievous laughter. And I looked around and I saw him, Mr. Mugaku. He's just as Mr. Walton described. The suit, the face, except he was holding his face in his hand. So his face was just a head, a blank black head, almost a shadow. The laughter, he's standing under a tree and the laughter, it continues. He's standing under a tree and there's light shining behind him. For some reason, I didn't feel afraid. I approached him. He looks at me and in a very bizarre, deep yet echoey voice, he says, I know what happened to you. I know what he did, and I can help you get your revenge. He reached out and handed the mask to me. I looked at the mask. I shook my head, and I ran away. I ran as fast as I could, and his laughter got even louder. And I woke up. I woke up to you brushing your teeth. I woke up and got up and started packing. I tried my best to act like it didn't happen, but I had to tell you, Richard. Richard was just floored. He didn't know what to make of that. I mean, what else do you say to that? So Richard just sat down and he just tried to take it all in. He tried to digest it all. Finally, he just looked at her and he goes, to hell with all of this. To hell with this place. To hell with that dream. It was just a dream. Margot was silent. Margot stood up and she looked at him and she says, many people do many wrong things towards me. Most of them are forgivable. Some of them are not. And I try to move on and forget about what they did to me. Sometimes I do that too much. Richard was very confused. What are you talking about, Margot? She just stares deep into his eyes. And she says, you know what I'm talking about. Richard stands up. He's He's mad at this point. He goes, I don't know what the hell you are talking about, Margot. You and I need to finish packing up our things and leave. Alright? It's a dumb legend. It was a stupid mask. Maybe it's an elaborate prank. I don't know. Either way, I am out of here. We are out of here. Margot, to his surprise, starts to laugh. She starts to laugh very uncontrollably. She gets pink in the face. It's like someone told her the best joke she's ever heard in her entire life, and she just can't help it. What are you doing? Margot, what has gotten into you? Are you crazy? Margot just kept laughing. She kept laughing, and she reached under the bed, and she pulled out the mask. The mask. And the eyes, they were glowing. She put the mask on. And as she put the mask on, Richard felt everything around him become a shadow almost. He heard loud, maniacal, mischievous laughter. Finally, she reached her hand towards Richard. And all of a sudden, Richard fell back. He fell back into what felt like a deep, deep pool. Later that day, Mr. Walton came to their room to see if they were okay. But all he found was an open window and Richard Thompson on the bed. Blood trickling out of his mouth. His eyes were white, lifeless.